Getting Googled. 2 months before Mom's death, an old friend emailed me a link to his brand new blog, a daily chronicle of his new job as a male hooker. "You should be doing this," he told me. The blog, he meant, not the prostitution. Though I did fantasize what I could do with $200 an hour. Maybe, he needled me, you start writing again. Since I had a Greta Garbo-esque aversion to leaving the house, the blog I created felt a little tame in comparison. 2 months clean, but still half nuts from the reluctant ebb of whiskey and meth, I huddled in the flat on South Van Ness, serenaded most nights by the hostile roommate across the narrow hall, who rehearsed with enormous gusto for his upcoming role in an amateur production of Carmen. But virtual company I could handle. And after a few weeks, I found other bloggers who felt the need to broadcast their lives or shards of their lives with complete strangers. In those prehistoric days, as the AOL empire teetered at the brink of ruin, the online friends I shadowed were geeks and writers, and none of them, except the prostitute, had made a dime from their blog. The stories of the bloggers distracted and sustained me as the tremulous nightly arias from across the hall pierced through my headphones. I grew friendly with a man from New Orleans and a couple of New Yorkers. I got emails from Norway, London, and Sydney. For a while, I thought I was in love with a boy from Cleveland. I wrote openly about my hermetic life with a flawed grasp of privacy. One night, 6 months after Mom's death, my father dreamed that he and my mother were rifling through boxes of old papers together. When he woke, without knowing why, he searched the internet under her name and came across my blog, only to discover several startling facts about his oldest son, including my latest T-cell and viral load count. I arrived at work that morning to find an email waiting for me with one word in the subject line: devastated. I read the first paragraph of the 3-page email until my face caught fire. I stood up, walked in a tight circle, then sat down again. I stood up again. I paced the office, cleared a jam in the photocopier, returned to my desk, read the second paragraph, then hurried out the door, hightailing it up to the corner strip mall, where I asked the girl at Pete's if she had anything darker than French roast. Nothing, she said, was darker than French roast. I ordered a large and slumped on the bench outside, where pigeons, scabbed, pugnacious, missing toes, shook down a young woman nibbling too slow on her low-fat bran muffin. After she fled, the pigeons cocked their heads at me, measuring my scowl, and then skittered away. I felt a bit of my bravery return. Dear Dad, I'm sorry. I had every intention of telling you to your face, but Mom was sick and, well, the timing felt unfortunate. I assured him that my numbers were good and improving and that I might go years, the doctor said, without meds. I tried to think of something appropriate for the subject line and failed, so it simply read, R.E. devastated. A volley of emails containing more words than we exchanged in the last 30 years passed between us. Neither of us picked up the phone. The editor father and the writer son took cover in the written word. He couldn't understand, he said, this need for compulsive disclosure. How could I tell a bunch of strangers about testing positive, but not my own father? How could I have ever thought that crystal meth was a good idea? What's the point of revisiting old mistakes and hard childhood memories? Isn't it better just to move on? Maybe if I traveled more like he'd done, maybe if I saw more of the world, I'd write about something besides myself. More than once that week, I stomped up to Pete's to compose my replies among the one-toed pigeons. There are 2 forms of travel, I'd informed my father, exterior and interior. Delving within oneself, I would write, took far greater courage. Luckily for both of us, half of my fuming righteousness faded by the time I returned to the office and hit reply. It humbled me to realize that I still cared what he thought of me. I still wanted his approval. And though he may have been right, maybe I'd find greater happiness by ignoring the past while touring the planet. I could barely afford my rent, let alone a trip abroad, so I was stuck with myself. I read your entire blog, he said, all 8 months. I know, I wanted to tell him. I checked my traffic stats. Someone at the Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C., on a PC running Windows 98, using Internet Explorer 5.3, spent 64 hours and 23 minutes working their way through my archives. Don't take this the wrong way, he said, but I won't be reading your blog anymore. I went from knowing too little about you, he said, to knowing way too much. I don't really believe in an afterlife, but still to this day I find myself unable to dismiss Dad's dream about Mom, which had led him to my blog, as pure coincidence. The last week had felt hellish, yes, but we can no longer be called complete strangers. And I wondered if Mom, worried I might never have a father, had pulled a few celestial strings, slipping into his dreams in order to push us together. I posted this theory to my blog under the title, Bitch Slapped by an Angel. My fellow bloggers assured me that parental discovery and shock was simply a rite of passage. I'd quickly abandoned documenting my family with a video camera, since pointing the contraption at them felt crass, but I never stopped recording. A writer is a stealthier, less objective camera, and after Mom's death, I began to put my memories to use. Upon his request, I sent Dad a couple of essays I'd written about her. 2 days later, he wrote back, I hope you don't wish that I had died instead of your mother. I'd like to be more than just a footnote to your life. I had to hand it to him. His emails knocked the wind out of me. Right or wrong, more than once I'd measured the worth to me of each member of my family, and he hadn't come out on top. A few weeks before he'd found my blog, before his traveling advice, I'd planned one trip, spending my savings on a plane ticket to D.C. I'd done so purely out of obligation, dreading the awkward silence that fell between us when we'd run out of things to say. The day I'd first read through Dad's devastated email, somewhere between the 4th and 5th paragraphs, I clicked over to the U.S. Airways homepage long enough to confirm my suspicion, non-refundable ticket. A year had passed since a plane flew into the Pentagon. But now a sniper terrorized the D.C. Beltway, cutting people down in the middle of their daily errands, including an FBI analyst outside the Home Depot near my father's townhouse. The cops and the media had everyone looking for one man in a white panel truck. It turned out to be two gunmen driving a blue Chevy Caprice. A man and a boy mistakenly referred to in some early reports as father and son. They killed women at bus stops and men gassing up their cars and one guy mowing his lawn. I didn't fear the snipers exactly. The writer in me sort of looked forward to flying into the center of that story. But between the deaths and my father's devastation, I pictured D.C. as a place of no cover. Dad and I didn't talk about the blog, however, at least not at first. We made small talk at the kitchen table, allowing Dick to fill in the awkward gaps of silence as he puttered about, cooking for me the straightforward food of my Midwestern childhood. I knew what the spaghetti sauce would taste like. I knew which paper napkins would line the basket of garlic bread and the 3 bottles of Kraft dressing he'd set on the table. I may not have known my father's well, but we have a history. They hadn't really warmed to D.C., finding it hard to make friends in a city preoccupied with power on the cusp of George W. But they resolved to stick it out 2 more years when both could retire with full government pensions to the modest house they'd already bought outside Lake Tahoe in the Carson Valley, Nevada. A few years later, the 3 of us would grab brunch at a restaurant on Tahoe Shore, and Dick would send back his Cobb salad, telling the waitress it was too hoity-toity. Though I dreaded them, the hours I spent alone with Dad that weekend surprised me. He took me shopping in Georgetown, which gave 2 introverts a harmless distraction. He trailed after me through Urban Outfitters, looking around warily. They have an interesting variety of products here, he said. And a few minutes later, I turned to find him perched patiently in a multicolored butterfly chair, a middle-aged man surrounded by loud music, loud clothes, and loud girls. Later at Banana Republic, he brought me over to a sweater display. This is the only thing I really like in here, he said, pointing to a striped V-neck. But do you think it's too young for me? I laughed at first, but then stopped short. He never asked me such a thing. He never asked me to lay judgment on him. And right then, I could finally glimpse through the thick silence and old grudges hanging between us, through all the ways we'd failed to understand each other. I could see him clearly, a good man trying to show his city to his oldest son. I saw for the first time that my years at the gym had made me bigger than him. I saw that I had been handling him gently to avoid hurting him, and that I would continue to do so. My heart broke a little, and I told him the truth. No, it's not too young for you, but it's not really your style. A moment later, a young, skinny sales boy with an asymmetrical haircut appeared at Dad's side. "Is that a members-only jacket?" he asked. I whirled and glared at the scrawny punk with his stupid offset mullet, but his interest appeared genuine. "I keep seeing them in thrift stores," he said. My father nodded, and the boy said simply, "Cool." I had no clue that the 80s were back in style. At some point during my slow dance with whiskey and meth, I'd lost my grasp on current fashion, and now, as I measured the sales boy's sincerity, I felt my age. The middle exhibit in our display of 3 generations of gay, standing together in knitwear. Dad decided against the V-neck, and so we nodded to the sales boy and ducked out into the drizzle, strolling down the damp cobblestone streets of Old Georgetown. I admired the brick row houses. "They're pretty," he agreed, "but imagine the cost of upkeep. The heating bill alone would bankrupt you." I kept quiet, the dreamy boy inside me refusing to be swayed by reason. The boy who still thought there was all the time in the world to be anyone he wanted, living in any house he passed. Mom would have admired those houses, I thought, if she were here. A moment of petulance, maybe. But every time I felt my father and I take a step towards each other, he'd say something about heating bills, or credit card debt, or 401ks. I sighed and looked away from him at the trees lining the cobblestone streets. A lifelong sucker for the melancholy of fall, I took refuge from him and our surroundings, gazing up at the brilliant rain-slicked leaves, yellow and red against the slate gray sky. Despite his efforts, a few of Dad's traits hadn't been passed down to me, and I pictured myself sitting on the stoop of every drafty house we passed, defying snipers and heating bills and common sense. I was too young to know that heating bills, credit card debt, and 401ks are code words for "son, I want to protect you." If you asked me that day to bet on the family member I'd visit the most in the coming years, the one with whom I trade 100 emails, I'd have placed my chips on anyone but the man now walking beside me, and I would have lost. Some of Mom had rubbed off on me, though, and like her, I believed in reinvention. Would I let him into my life? Would I let us be worth more to each other? Or would I fall back on our old family physics? A body at rest stays at rest, but a body in motion. Trudging beside him through the leaves and drizzle, I remembered how I'd glared at the salesboy, wanting to protect my father, and how the feeling had surprised me. I'd felt it before when Mark had been stabbed, and when Mom had gotten sick, each time stunned by the strength of the feeling. I knew that's what you're supposed to feel for family, a word that had never seemed to fit the 4 of us. What we created together felt so flimsy, each of us slipping from it like from a burning house, one by one, less a family than a series of 4 exits. That's the story I told myself. But a scrawny salesboy had come along, and now I could see that I'd sold us all short. I could run 2,000 miles away, fooling myself with the myth of the self-made man, but nothing had formed me like my mother, my father, and my brother.